You owe my mom a life. The sentence didn't echo, it sliced, clean and sharp through the soft jazz drifting across William Carter's $40 million mansion, through the quiet clink of crystal glasses and the low hum of powerful people pretending not to hear what didn't concern them. And for a moment, no one moved, not the servers, not the guests, not even the security standing just feet away from the boy who clearly didn't belong there. A skinny black kid in a faded hoodie, sneakers worn thin at the soles, clutching a delivery bag like it was the only thing keeping him grounded in a room built on power and silence. Jaden Brooks didn't blink, didn't lower his hand as he pointed straight past the billionaire, past the marble columns and gold-lit walls, to a single photograph hanging above the fireplace, a photo that didn't match the rest, because while the others were filled with business partners and staged smiles, this one was different, softer, real. A woman laughing under sunlight, her hand resting lightly on the shoulder of a younger William Carter. And that was the moment everything shifted, because the second Carter turned and saw where the boy was pointing, something in his face cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for the air to change, enough for the room to feel it, even if they didn't understand it. Her name was Angela Brooks, Jaden said, his voice steady in a way that didn't match his age, didn't match the way his fingers trembled just slightly at his side. Why is she in your house? And you have to understand something about men like William Carter. Men who build empires out of decisions and distance. They don't freeze. They don't hesitate. They move. They command. They control. But not this time. Not when a name he buried years ago rose back into the light like it had been waiting, patient, quiet, unstoppable. Because Angela Brooks wasn't just a memory. She was a moment he chose to walk away from. A story he rewrote with money and silence. A chapter he convinced himself no one would ever read again. And yet here it was, standing right in front of him in the shape of a 14-year-old boy who looked at him not with fear, but with something far more dangerous, truth. The guests shifted awkwardly, whispers crawling across the room like cracks in glass, security unsure whether to step in or step back. Because something bigger than protocol was happening, something no amount of wealth could immediately fix, and Carter, for the first time in a very long time, didn't know what to say. His eyes locked on the photo, then back to the boy, then back again, like he was trying to measure the distance between who he used to be and who he had become, and failing. Because some distances can't be measured in miles or money, only in regret. Jaden took a step forward, just one, but it was enough to tilt the balance of the entire room. She never talked about you, he added, quieter now, but heavier. Not once. And that landed harder than the first sentence, because silence can be louder than any accusation. And in that silence, Carter felt it. The weight of something unfinished, something unpaid, something no contract had ever covered. And for a second, just a second, the most powerful man in the room looked like he was standing in a place he didn't own anymore. Because that mansion, those walls, that carefully constructed life, none of it had prepared him for this. For a boy who carried a name he couldn't erase, for a truth that didn't care how much it cost to hide it. And as the room held its breath, waiting for him to respond, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't about a photo. It never was. It was about what happened before it was taken, and what he did after. William Carter did not answer right away, and that silence stretched longer than anyone in the room was comfortable with. Thick and heavy like a storm waiting to break. Because men like him were never supposed to hesitate, never supposed to look uncertain. Yet there he stood, eyes flicking between the boy and the photograph as if both of them were equally real and equally impossible. And somewhere in that space between memory and denial, something began to surface, slow and uninvited. He took a step closer, not commanding, not authoritative, just closer. His polished shoes echoing softly against the marble floor as the guests instinctively shifted back, giving space to something they did not understand but could feel. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than expected, almost careful. Where did you say your name was from? But Jaden did not move, did not soften, because this was not a conversation he came here to ease into. This was a question he had carried for months. Ever since the day he found that same photograph tucked inside a box of his mother's old things, hidden beneath folded letters and worn-out notebooks, a photo she never explained, a man she never named. and a silence that suddenly felt too loud to ignore. "Brooks," Jaden replied, each letter clear, steady. "My name is Jaden Brooks." And that was when it hit. Not like a crash, but like something slipping into place that had been missing for far too long. Because the last time William Carter heard that name, it had not belonged to a stranger. It had belonged to a woman who stood in a much smaller room. Years ago, sunlight pouring through cheap blinds. Her voice calm but unshakable as she told him something he was not ready to hear. Something he chose not to believe, or maybe chose not to stay for. And the memory did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments. A laugh, a look, the way she held her ground when everyone else stepped aside, the way she refused to be impressed by money or promises, the way she said his name like it was just a name, not a title, not a power, just a person. And that was what unsettled him the most, because there had been a time when he was just that, before the empire, before the distance, before the decisions that slowly turned people into numbers and moments into missed chances. "Angela," he said quietly, almost to himself, and the room leaned in without realizing it, drawn by a story that was no longer hidden, and Jaden caught it, that shift, that crack in the man everyone else seemed to fear, and for the first time, there was something else in his eyes, not doubt, not anger, but recognition, because whatever this was, whatever truth was sitting between them, it was no longer one-sided. Carter exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that failed to steady him the way it usually did, and he looked back at the photograph again, really looked this time, at the version of himself that stood beside her, younger, less guarded, unaware of what he would eventually become. And then he looked at the boy, at the same eyes, the same quiet strength he once saw in her, and the distance between past and present collapsed just enough to make one thing impossible to ignore. This was not coincidence. This was consequence. And somewhere deep in the foundation of everything he built, there was a story he left unfinished, a truth he never faced, and now it was standing in front of him, asking a question he could no longer afford to walk away from. "How old are you?" he asked. But even as the words left his mouth, he already knew the answer would not just be a number, it would be a timeline, a measure of everything he missed, everything he chose not to see. And Jaden answered without hesitation, 14. And that number did not echo. It settled, heavy and exact, fitting too perfectly into a memory Carter had spent years trying to blur. And in that moment, the mansion, the guests, the carefully controlled world around him faded into the background, because none of it mattered as much as the realization beginning to take shape, slow but undeniable, that the truth was not just about Angela Brooks being in his house. It was about why she was never there again, and what he had done, or failed to do, when it mattered most. 14 did not just sit in the air. It anchored itself into something deeper, something that refused to be ignored, and William Carter felt it settle into his chest like a quiet truth he had spent years outrunning. Because timelines do not lie, and neither do the small details people try to forget. His jaw tightened, not out of anger, but restraint. The kind that comes when a man realizes control is no longer his strongest weapon, and for a brief moment, the room around him blurred into insignificance, the conversations fading into distant noise as his focus narrowed entirely on the boy standing in front of him. A boy who carried more than just a name, more than just a question. He carried a living reminder of a decision Carter once made and never corrected. "Your mother," Carter began slowly, choosing each word with care. "When did she pass?" And the question was not cold, not clinical. It carried something unfamiliar, something almost human, but Jaden did not soften, because grief had already shaped him into someone who did not need comfort from strangers, especially not from a man whose presence was now tangled in that grief. 3 months ago, Jaden replied, his voice steady but quieter, like the weight of that timeline had already been carried too long to feel new. "She got sick. But she still worked until the end. She said she had to, said some things in life do not wait." And that sentence lingered, because it sounded like something Angela would say, something Carter remembered hearing in a different context, a different time, when life had not yet divided them into separate worlds. Carter looked down briefly, not in defeat, but in recognition, and that was when the memory sharpened, no longer fragments, no longer distant, but clear, vivid, undeniable, Angela standing across from him in that small apartment years ago, her hand resting protectively over her stomach, her voice calm but firm as she told him she was going to keep the baby and him, younger, driven, already halfway consumed by the future he was chasing, hearing her words but not truly listening, offering solutions that sounded practical but felt empty, suggesting timing was wrong, that things could be handled later, that there were options, always options, but none of them included staying. None of them included choosing her over everything else that was waiting for him outside that door. I tried to find you, Carter said suddenly, the words coming faster. Now, less controlled, as if silence had finally run out of space to hide. I did not know where she went. She left without telling me. But even as he said it, there was hesitation, because truth is rarely that simple, and deep down, he knew that leaving without a trace is something people do when they believe staying will not change anything. Jaden's expression did not shift, not even slightly. And that was the part Carter was not prepared for. Not anger, not accusation, just a quiet, steady gaze that held him accountable without raising its voice. And then Jaden spoke. She said you had choices. And that sentence landed heavier than anything else that had been said so far, because it was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was simple, direct, and impossible to argue with. She said some people walk away because they think they can come back later, but later does not always wait. And there it was, the echo of Angela's voice carried through her son, the same clarity, the same refusal to bend truth into something more comfortable. Carter exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that does not bring relief, only awareness, and he looked around the room, at the polished surfaces, the carefully constructed image of success, and for the first time, it all felt distant, disconnected from the moment unfolding in front of him, because none of it could answer the question that now mattered most, not to the guests, not to the business world, but to the boy standing here, and to the man he used to be. Did she ever tell you about me? Carter asked, quieter now, almost hesitant, and Jaden paused, just for a second, not to think, but to decide how much truth this moment deserved. And when he answered, his voice was calm, unwavering. No, she did not tell me your name. She did not tell me where you lived. She did not tell me what you became, he said, then added. But she kept that picture, and that was the detail that shifted everything again. Because people do not keep reminders of nothing. They keep reminders of something unfinished, something unresolved, something that still holds weight even after years have passed, and Carter felt it then, fully. The realization that this was not just about a past he had buried. It was about a connection that had never truly been erased, only delayed. And now that delay had ended, standing in front of him, asking not just for answers, but for something far more difficult, acknowledgement. The word acknowledgement did not come easily to William Carter, not in boardrooms, not in negotiations, and certainly not here, standing face to face with a boy who had every reason to demand more than just words. Yet that was exactly what this moment required, not contracts, not solutions, but something far less comfortable and far more real. Carter straightened slightly, not to regain control, but as if preparing himself to stand inside a truth he could no longer step around, his voice quieter. Now, stripped of the authority that usually defined it, she deserved more than what I gave her, he said, and it was not an excuse, not a defense, just a statement, simple and late. And the room felt it, that shift from power to something closer to honesty, because there is a difference between explaining and admitting. And for the first time, Carter was doing the latter. Jaden listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his silence was not passive, it was measured, as if he was weighing every word against something deeper, something his mother had already taught him long before this moment. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried that same grounded clarity. She did not wait for more, he said. She built what she could without it, and there was no anger in it, no bitterness, just fact. And facts have a way of cutting through everything else. Carter nodded once, slowly, absorbing that, because it aligned too perfectly with the woman he remembered, the one who never asked for permission to move forward, who never needed approval to stand on her own. And yet there was something else now, something that had not existed back then, a consequence that stood right in front of him, living, breathing, undeniable. Did she struggle? Carter asked, and the question hung carefully between them, not out of curiosity, but responsibility. And Jaden hesitated, not because he did not know the answer, but because some truths are not meant to be softened. She worked 2 jobs, he said. Morning shifts at a diner, nights cleaning offices downtown, sometimes both in the same day, he continued, his voice steady. She said hard work was not something to complain about. It was something to respect, and each word built a picture Carter could not ignore, a life that continued without him, shaped by effort instead of opportunity, by resilience instead of resources, and the contrast between that life and the one he stood in now was not subtle. It was overwhelming. Carter glanced around his mansion again, the high ceilings, the polished surfaces, the quiet luxury that had always felt like success, and for the first time, it looked different, not impressive, not comforting, just distant, like a place built on decisions that now demanded to be questioned. I would have helped, he said, almost instinctively, but the moment the words left his mouth, they felt incomplete, because help is not something you offer after the fact. It is something you choose when it matters, and Jaden caught that immediately, not with hostility, but with clarity. She did not need what you would have done, he replied. She needed what you did not do. And that was the line that settled everything into place, because it was not about money, not about missed support. It was about presence, about staying when leaving was easier, about choosing people over possibilities, and Carter had not done that. The silence returned, but this time it was different, not tense, not uncertain, but full, filled with a truth that had finally been spoken aloud. And in that silence, Carter felt something shift inside him, not dramatic, not sudden, but real, the kind of shift that does not announce itself. It simply changes the way everything else is seen. He looked back at Jaden, really looked this time, not as a stranger, not as an interruption, but as someone connected to a part of his life he could no longer deny. And for the first time since this began, there was no distance in his voice when he spoke again. I cannot change what happened, he said, but I am here now. And it was not a promise, not yet, just a statement. But even statements carry weight when they are finally grounded in truth. Jaden held his gaze for a moment longer, searching, not for perfection, not for redemption, but for something simpler, something more difficult to fake, sincerity. And the room waited, not for power to speak, but for something far more rare, for what would come next when truth had finally been acknowledged, but not yet resolved. The word sincerity did not rush in to fill the silence. It lingered just out of reach, fragile and uncertain, because moments like this were not built on declarations. They were built on what came after them. And Jaden understood that better than most, standing there with nothing but truth and a question that still had not been fully answered. He shifted his weight slightly, not backing down, not stepping forward, just holding his ground in a way that felt older than 14, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but sharper. Being here now does not change where you were before, and the words landed without force, without anger, yet they carried a clarity that could not be dismissed, because time does not bend for regret. It only moves forward, leaving decisions exactly where they were made. William. Carter did not respond immediately, not because he had nothing to say, but because for once, he was measuring his words against something other than outcome, something deeper than strategy, and that took time, more time than he was used to allowing himself, his eyes lowering briefly as if searching for something in the space between what he had built and what he had left behind. And when he looked back up, there was no trace of the polished certainty that once defined him, only a man standing inside the consequences of his own choices. You are right, he said finally, each word deliberate, steady. It does not change it. And there was no attempt to soften that truth, no attempt to redirect it, just acceptance. And that alone shifted something in the room, because acceptance is not loud, it does not demand attention, but it changes everything that follows. Jaden watched him carefully, not impressed, not convinced, just aware, because words were easy to say when there was nothing left to lose, but meaning them required something else entirely, something that could not be performed. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence returning once more, but this time it felt less like tension and more like space for something real to take shape. Carter glanced toward the photograph again, his gaze lingering there longer now, not as a memory, but as a reminder. and when he spoke, it was not directed at the room, not even fully at Jaden, but at the truth itself. She walked away because she believed I would not stay, he said, and there was no denial in it, only recognition. And she was not wrong. And that was the closest he had come to saying what mattered most, not just that he had made a mistake, but that he understood why it mattered. Jaden exhaled slowly, not in relief, not in frustration, just in acknowledgement of hearing something real, something that aligned with everything his mother had lived by. And yet, there was still a distance between them, not physical, but emotional, built from years that could not be rewritten and moments that could not be revisited. She did not hate you, Jaden said after a pause, and that sentence shifted the air in a different way, softer, but no less powerful, because it introduced something unexpected, not forgiveness, not yet, but perspective. She just stopped expecting anything. And that was the line that settled deepest of all, because there is a difference between anger and absence leaves nothing to argue with. Carter's expression tightened slightly, not in defense, but in understanding, because that kind of silence, the kind Angela had chosen, was not about punishment, it was about moving forward without looking back, and that realization carried more weight than any accusation ever could. He took a slow breath, steadying himself not for control, but for honesty, and then he did something no one in the room expected, something that did not fit the image he had spent years building. He stepped past the invisible line that separated them, closing the distance not as a man of power, but as someone willing to stand closer to the truth. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something unpracticed. I do not expect anything from you, he said. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, he continued. But I will not walk away this time. And it was not a promise wrapped in certainty. It was a choice stated in the present, simple and unprotected, and that made it real in a way nothing else had been so far. Jaden held his gaze, searching once more, not for perfection, not for redemption, but for consistency between what was said and what would come next. Because this moment was not the end of a story, it was the beginning of something far more difficult, a test not of words, but of what happens after them. And as the room stood still, watching something far more powerful than status unfold, one truth remained clear. The past had finally been spoken, but the future had yet to be proven. The word proven did not belong to the past. It belonged to what came next, and that was where everything became uncertain again, because truth may open the door, but it does not decide who walks through it. And Jaden knew that as well as anyone, standing there with the weight of everything his mother had lived through resting quietly behind his eyes. He shifted his grip on the delivery bag, the thin plastic rustling softly in the otherwise silent room, a small, almost forgotten detail that reminded everyone watching that this moment had started with something ordinary, a delivery, a job, a boy trying to get through another day, and yet now it stood at the edge of something far from ordinary, something neither of them had planned for. Why did you keep it? Jaden asked, nodding slightly toward the photograph, his voice not accusing, not emotional, just direct, because that question mattered, not for the past, but for what it revealed about the present. And William Carter followed his gaze again, slower this time, as if the answer was not something he could reach for quickly, but something he had to face fully. Because I could not forget her, he said, and the words came without hesitation, but they did not feel like a defense. They felt like a confession, simple and unpolished. I tried to move forward. I told myself it was necessary, that I had made the right choice, but every time I looked at that picture, I knew I had left something unfinished. And there it was again, that word, unfinished, not broken, not erased, just left behind. Waiting, Jaden listened, his expression still steady, but there was a shift now, not in what he felt, but in how he was listening. Because this was no longer just about confronting a stranger, it was about understanding a part of his own story that had always been missing, a piece his mother had chosen not to explain, and now that piece was speaking for itself. She never showed me that picture, Jaden said, almost thoughtfully. She kept it hidden, like it belonged to a different life. And that detail settled between them, because it revealed something Carter had not considered before, not just that Angela had moved on, but that she had drawn a line, a boundary between what was and what had been. and she had protected that boundary, even in silence. Carter nodded slowly, absorbing that, because it fit, it matched the woman he remembered, the one who chose her path without waiting for anyone to follow. And yet it also raised something else, something he could not ignore anymore, a question that had been forming quietly beneath everything else. Why come here? He asked, not as a challenge, not as a defense, but as a genuine attempt to understand. If she never spoke about me, if she moved on, why did you come looking for answers now? And Jaden paused, not because he did not know, but because the answer was not simple. It was layered, built from moments that did not make sense until they were placed together. Because she kept it, he said finally. She never talked about you, but she never threw it away either, he continued, his voice steady. And when she got sick, she told me something. And that was where the air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, because this was not just about the past anymore. It was about something recent, something intentional. Carter's focus sharpened immediately, his posture straightening slightly, not out of control, but attention, because whatever Angela had said in those final days, it mattered. It carried weight that extended beyond everything that had already been revealed. What did she say? Carter asked, quieter now, and Jaden met his gaze without hesitation, the distance between them no longer defined by space, but by what was about to be understood. She said if I ever wanted to understand where I come from, I should not look for answers in what people say. Jaden began, his voice calm, measured. I should look at what they choose to keep. And the words settled deeply, because they reframed everything, not as a confrontation, not as an accusation, but as a search for truth. Through action, through what remains when everything else is gone. Carter looked back at the photograph once more, and this time, it did not feel like a memory. It felt like evidence, not of who he was, but of what he had chosen to hold on to, even when he told himself he had moved on. And in that realization, something shifted again, not just in how he saw the past, but in how he understood the present. Jaden adjusted the strap of his bag slightly, a small, grounding motion, and then he said, something that changed the direction of everything that would come next. She told me I would know the truth when I saw how you reacted. And that was it. Not a test written in words, not a message wrapped in explanation, just a simple instruction, observe, understand, decide. And now that moment had arrived, not in a quiet room, not in a distant memory, but right here, in a mansion built on certainty that was now being measured against something far less predictable, something no amount of wealth could control, the truth of who someone chooses to be when the past finally stands in front of them. The truth of who someone chooses to be does not arrive in a speech. It reveals itself in the smallest decisions, the quiet ones, the ones no one can rehearse. And William Carter felt that weight settle fully on his shoulders as Jaden's words lingered in the air, not demanding an answer, but demanding something far more difficult, consistency. The room remained still, watching, but no longer important, because this moment had narrowed down to just two people and a past that refused to stay buried. And Carter understood something now that he had not understood before. This was not about convincing the boy. It was about showing him, not through power, not through promises, but through what he chose next. He took a slow breath, steady and deliberate. And then, without looking back at the guests, without signaling for approval or control, he made a decision that seemed small on the surface but shifted everything underneath it. Cancel the meeting, he said quietly to his assistant, who stood frozen near the edge of the room, unsure if she had heard correctly, because nothing on Carter's schedule moved without intention. And yet here he was, clearing it without hesitation, not for a deal, not for a partner, but for a conversation that could not be rescheduled. The assistant nodded quickly, stepping away to carry out the order, and that was when the first ripple moved through the room, subtle but undeniable, because power had just stepped aside for something personal, something real. And people notice when that happens. Carter turned back to Jaden, his posture no longer distant, no longer guarded. And for the first time, there was no barrier between them, no invisible line separating roles or status, just two people standing in a moment that neither of them had expected. Come with me, Carter said, not as a command, but as an invitation. And he gestured toward a quieter part of the house, away from the eyes, away from the noise, because some conversations are not meant for an audience. They are meant for truth, and truth needs space. Jaden hesitated, not out of fear, but thought, because following someone into their world requires trust, even if it is temporary, even if it is cautious, and trust is not something given lightly, especially not to someone who once walked away from everything you came from. But then he looked at the photograph again, at his mother's smile frozen in a moment he had never seen before, and something inside him shifted, not acceptance, not forgiveness, but curiosity, the kind that asks what else has been left unsaid, and slowly, without a word, he nodded. They moved through the hallway in silence, the sound of their footsteps soft against the polished floors, passing walls lined with achievements, awards, carefully curated moments of success. But none of them held the same weight as the single photograph they had just left behind, because those moments were built, chosen, displayed, while that one had been kept, protected, for reasons that were only now becoming clear. Carter led him into a smaller room, less formal, quieter, with a large window overlooking the city, the skyline stretching out in clean lines and distant lights. And for a second, neither of them spoke, because sometimes silence is not empty. It is preparation. It is the space where something real can finally take shape. Carter walked over to a desk, opened a drawer, and paused, his hand resting there for just a moment longer than necessary. As if what he was about to reveal carried more than just information, it carried consequence. And when he finally pulled it open, he reached inside and took out something worn, something that did not belong in a place like this. A small envelope, edges softened with time, and he held it carefully, not like an object, but like something that had waited long enough. He turned back to Jaden, his expression steady but no longer controlled in the way it had been before, and without saying a word, he extended the envelope toward him, offering not an explanation, not a defense, but something tangible, something that could not be reshaped by memory or perspective, only seen for what it was. Jaden looked at it, then at Carter, then back again, and in that moment, the test his mother had left him with became clear, not in theory, not in words, but in action, because truth does not hide when it is ready to be seen. It shows itself in what people are willing to reveal when they no longer have anything to protect. And as Jaden slowly reached out to take the envelope, one question remained, not spoken, but present in everything that had led to this moment. What had been kept all these years, and why had it never been sent? The envelope did not look like much, just paper worn thin at the edges, the kind that had been opened and closed more times than it should have been. But the weight of it was not in its size. It was in the years it carried, the silence it held, and Jaden felt that the moment his fingers touched it, a quiet heaviness that did not belong to him, but somehow had always been part of his story. He turned it over slowly, noticing there was no stamp, no address, nothing to suggest it had ever been meant to travel. Only a name written on the front in careful, deliberate handwriting, Angela, and that alone said more than any explanation could, because this was not something forgotten, it was something kept, intentionally, consistently, over time. Jaden glanced up briefly, his eyes meeting Carter's, searching for something, a hint, a reason, but Carter did not interrupt, did not explain, he simply stood there, allowing the truth to reveal itself in its own time. And that was different from before, different from the man who once controlled every narrative, because now he was not shaping the moment, he was letting it unfold, slowly. Jaden opened the envelope, careful not to tear it, as if preserving it mattered, as if what was inside deserved that level of respect. And when he pulled out the folded paper, he paused for just a second before unfolding it, not out of fear, but anticipation, because whatever this was, it had been waiting longer than he had known to ask the question. The paper was aged, the ink slightly faded, but the words were still clear, written in a steady hand that did not rush, did not hesitate, and Jaden began to read silently, his eyes moving line by line as the room around him seemed to fade further into the background, leaving only the sound of his own breath and the quiet presence of the man standing across from him. And as he read, something shifted, not sudden, not dramatic, but undeniable, because this was not a letter filled with excuses or explanations. It was something else entirely, something that did not try to rewrite the past, but acknowledged it in a way that could not be ignored. Carter watched him closely, not impatient, not defensive, just present, because he knew what was written there. He had written it himself, years ago, in a moment when clarity had come too late to change anything, but early enough to understand everything. And yet he had never sent it, never found a way, or perhaps never found the courage to place it into the hands it was meant for. Jaden's expression changed slightly as he continued reading, not softening, not hardening, just processing, because the words in front of him were not the version of William Carter the world knew. They were quieter, more human, stripped of certainty, and filled with something closer to regret. And that contrast mattered, because it showed not who he had become, but who he had been when no one else was watching. After a long moment, Jaden lowered the paper just slightly, his eyes lifting again, this time different. Not questioning, not challenging, but seeing, truly seeing. The space between what had been said and what had been done, and he asked the one question that mattered most, not about the past, not about the letter itself, but about the choice that defined everything. Why did you not send it? And the question settled in the room like a final piece waiting to be placed, because the answer to that was not written on the page. It lived in the decision that followed it. Carter did not look away, did not search for a way around it. He met the question directly, and for a moment, he said nothing, not because he did not know the answer, but because he understood its weight, understood that this was where truth moved from acknowledgement into responsibility. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried no defense, no distance, only honesty. Because I thought time would fix what I broke, he said, each word measured, grounded. And by the time I realized it would not, I believed it was too late to matter. And there it was, simple, flawed, real. A decision built not on malice, but on avoidance, on the belief that silence could protect both sides from something that only grew heavier the longer it was left unspoken. Jaden listened, the letter still in his hand, the weight of it now clearer than before, and in that moment, the story his mother had never told him was no longer hidden. It was unfolding right in front of him, not perfectly, not neatly, but truth rarely is. And as he looked down at the paper once more, then back at the man who had written it, one realization became impossible to ignore. This was not just about what had been lost, it was about what had been left unfinished, and whether unfinished things could ever truly find their way back to meaning. Some truths do not end a story. They begin the part where choices finally matter. And Jaden stood there with the letter still in his hands, feeling the difference between words that were written and actions that were lived, because what William Carter had just admitted was not a mystery anymore. It was a decision, a moment in time where silence had been chosen over courage, and now that silence had a face, a voice, a consequence standing right in front of him. The room felt quieter than before, not empty, but settled, as if everything that needed to be revealed had finally stepped into the light, and what remained was not the past, but the present, the only place where anything could still change. Jaden folded the letter slowly, carefully, not rushing the movement, as if giving himself time to understand what it meant, not just as a story about his mother, but as something that connected directly to him, to the life he had lived without answers, to the questions he had learned to stop asking because no one had ever been there to answer them. He looked up at Carter again, and this time his expression carried something new, not anger, not confusion, but clarity, the kind that comes when the unknown becomes known, even if it is not perfect, even if it does not fix anything immediately. She waited, Jaden said quietly, his voice steady, not accusing, just stating something that had been real whether Carter had seen it or not. She never said your name, but she waited. And those words landed differently than anything before, because they did not demand a response. They revealed a truth that had existed outside of Carter's awareness, outside of his timeline, a truth that did not disappear just because it had not been acknowledged. Carter absorbed that, the weight of it settling in a way that numbers and deals never could, because this was not about success or failure. It was about presence, about the moments that define a life not by what is achieved, but by what is shared, and what is missed when it is not. He nodded once, slowly, not as agreement, but as acceptance, because there are some things that cannot be undone, only recognized, and recognition is where responsibility begins. I cannot change that, Carter said, his voice calm but grounded in something deeper than before, but I can decide what happens now. And there it was, not a promise, not a defense, but a shift, a movement away from what had already been written into something that could still be shaped. Jaden studied him for a moment, not looking for perfection, not expecting certainty, just watching. Because people reveal who they are not in what they say when it is easy, but in what they do when it is not. And this moment was not easy for either of them. Outside the window, the city lights continued their quiet rhythm, unchanged by what had just taken place inside the room. A reminder that the world does not pause for personal truths. It keeps moving, and people have to choose whether they move with it or stay where they are. Jaden placed the letter back into the envelope, but he did not return it. He held on to it, not as something to protect, but as something that belonged to him now, a piece of his story that had finally found its way into his hands. Then start with the truth, he said, his voice steady, clear, and simple, because sometimes the path forward is not complicated. It just requires honesty, consistency, and the willingness to stay when leaving would be easier. Carter did not hesitate this time, did not look away, because this was the moment that defined everything that came after, and he nodded again, more certain, more grounded, because for the first time in a long time, he was not trying to control the outcome. He was choosing to be present for it. And in that quiet room, with no audience, no pressure, no performance, something shifted, not dramatically, not instantly, but meaningfully, because power had stepped aside, and in its place stood something far more difficult to maintain: accountability. The past remained what it was, unchanged, unedited. But the future, for the first time, was no longer shaped by silence. It was being rebuilt by truth, one decision at a time. And as Jaden turned toward the door, not walking away, but moving forward, one thing became clear in a way that did not need to be spoken. Money could build a mansion, but it could not rewrite a life. Only the choices made after the truth is revealed can do that.